Russia. This released captive greeting his mother. The two sides traded another 300 prisoners each on Friday. The exchange comes under a new agreement reached in recent talks in Geneva. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says the officers were defending the country's front line. Torrential rains and heavy floods have inundated towns in Peru's southern Aina district. The Sharkey-Huto River burst its banks on Friday, flooding homes and streets in the city of Ayacucho with mud and debris. Rescue teams have been deployed to the area to assist local authorities. Indonesia has announced a ban on social media and other popular online platforms for under 16s. The measure aims to protect young people from online harm. Indonesia's communications minister announced that platforms considered high risk will be deactivated from the end of this month. Since Australia became the first nation to implement a youth social media ban, several states are considering following suit. In Nepal, the party of a rapper turned politician is leading in at least 2/3 of seats after Thursday's general election. 35-year-old Balendra Shah was the mayor of Kathmandu, and his popularity has surged since a youth-led uprising toppled the government last year. Tony Chang reports from Kathmandu.
A day after the election and counting is still going on all across Nepal. The Election Commission estimates they won't have a proper result for 4 days or as long as a week. And that's not surprising given the geographic complications of this mountainous Himalayan nation. But what we are seeing in the results that have been counted is a very clear shift to the RSP, the National Independence Party. What some people here are calling a blue wave. Now, we didn't have much of a sense before the election because of the tight restrictions the Election Commission put on polling information. But that was what we were hearing from people that we spoke to, that they wanted to vote for a change. And the question now seems to be not is the RSP going to win, but by how much? And will they get the 2/3 majority that will allow them to change the constitution? That also suggests that Balendra Shah, the charismatic rapper and former mayor of Kathmandu, could be heading towards the job of Prime Minister. It also signifies a huge change for politics here in Nepal, with people deserting the traditional parties that have ruled for decades. But it certainly seems to reflect what people told us as they were voting yesterday, and that was that they wanted a change. Tony Chang, Al Jazeera, Kathmandu.
A crowd of thousands had gathered in Chicago to pay their final respects to the late Reverend Jesse Jackson. A towering figure of the U.S. civil rights movement, he died last month at the age of 84. Jackson was the protege of Martin Luther King Jr. and a two-time presidential candidate. 3 former presidents, Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, and Joe Biden, are attending the service in Chicago.
He was a connector of people and a lover of people. He really bridged the gap between all ages because he not only served Chicago well, and we know him as a hometown father to many, but he was globally and internationally loved.
This man here, paved the way for so many other people to be able to make a difference in this world.
Everybody should know that how important Jesse Jackson was and how he made an impact in our lives and everybody's lives.
You're watching Al Jazeera's extensive coverage of the conflict between the U.S., Israel, and Iran. Here is a reminder of our top stories. The White House says its objectives in Iran should be met within 4 to 6 weeks. That's after Donald Trump said there would be no deal with Iran except unconditional surrender. His comments come as heavy strikes by U.S. and Israeli warplanes continue across the country. Israeli forces are also bombing parts of the Lebanese capital, Beirut. On Thursday, Israel issued an unprecedented forced evacuation order for residents in southern Beirut, including in Dahiyeh. Iran has launched another barrage of missiles at Israel. Waves of strikes since Saturday have caused extensive damage in Tel Aviv. At least 11 people have been killed in Israel since the conflict began. That is all from me, Riley Carlson. Sarah Heirat will be here with our continuing coverage of the conflict between the U.S., Israel, and Iran. And Inside Story examines whether Donald Trump has failed to sell the war in Iran to the world.
Has Donald Trump failed to sell the Iran war to the world? Some of Washington's allies have been critical and won't join the conflict. As fighting escalates, the US is still struggling to garner support from its partners. But does it need them to continue to wage this war? This is Inside Story. Hello again, I'm James Bays. Yet another day of US and Israeli strikes against Iran, and Washington says there's more to come, warning of a dramatic surge. But with the exception of Israel, the US has not secured the active participation of any of its main allies as it did in previous conflicts like Iraq and Afghanistan. President Donald Trump hasn't hidden his frustration with European leaders, many of whom say the ongoing war is a breach of international law. That view is shared by other global players like China and Russia. In just a moment, we'll discuss with our panel of guests the reasons why so many countries have so far refused to join the US in this conflict. But first, this report from Imogen Kimber.
In the weeks before the US and Israel attacked Iran, Washington was threatening to strike. But only a few of the US or Israel's allies say they were consulted ahead of the attacks. The EU has criticised Iran, but not the US and Israel for the violence. But a week into the war, no other states joined the fight. The UK has said it will not strike Iran, and the way forward is negotiation. But it is sending defences.
That we're sending 4 additional Typhoon jets to join our squadron in Qatar. Wildcat helicopters with anti-drone capabilities are arriving in Cyprus tomorrow. We're deploying HMS Dragon to the Mediterranean. And we have allowed the US to use British bases to conduct defensive operations.
France is sending its nuclear-powered aircraft carrier to the Mediterranean and also allowing the US to use its military bases defensively. However, the president says the French military is not involved and
nobody can think that the issues of Iran's nuclear program, ballistic missile activities, regional destabilization efforts can be simply solved with strikes.
Spain is sending support to Cyprus, but it has said it refuses to join the attacks and compared the conflict to the Iraq war.
The position of the Spanish government can be summed up in 4 words: no to the war. The world has been here before. 23 years ago, another US administration dragged us into a war in the Middle East.
US President Donald Trump was not happy.
Spain actually said that we can't use their bases, so we're going to cut off all trade with Spain.
And while the UK a strategically located base on the Chagos Islands.
By the way, I'm not happy with the UK either. This is not the age of Churchill. I will say the UK has been very, very uncooperative with that stupid island that they have, that they gave away. They ruin relationships. It's a shame.
According to Trump, Germany is helping out. But Beijing and Moscow have both condemned the US and Israel's attacks on Iran, calling on them to stop their aggression. China is one of the main consumers of Iranian oil, and Russia has said it may consider increasing the price of its oil as the war disrupts supply and pushes up prices. And from rising energy costs to the further breakdown of international law, the rest of the world will be forced to face the consequences of a war it did not start. Imogen Kimber, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Well, let's discuss all of this further with our guest joining us today on Inside Story. From Washington, D.C., we have Anatol Lieven. He is director of the Eurasia program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. From Brussels, Teresa Fallon, director of the Center for Russia, Europe and Asia Studies, and a senior fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And from Paris, General Dominique Trinquant, former head of the French military at the mission to the United Nations for France and also France's mission to NATO. Thank you, all 3 of you, for joining us today on Inside Story. Let me start with you in Brussels, Teresa. If we go back to the start of this conflict, within hours, the UN Security Council met.
That's the key place for players in the world to express their views. 15 members sit around the horseshoe table, but on this occasion, 14 of them were just bystanders, weren't they?
That's true. I call it the impotent herbivore problem here in Europe. The Europeans feel very frustrated that they're unable to shape the strategic landscape of even their nearest neighborhood. I'm talking about Ukraine. And now they, once again, are a bystander to what's happening in Iran. And Europeans are immediately feeling the effects of this in regard to increased energy prices that will have knock-on effects for inflation. And we're seeing also pressure in Europe. So there's more fragmentation in an already fragmented system. So we see tensions between Germany and France. Macron is kind of turning towards Sanchez, and he's being criticized by many for not standing up for other EU members when he was in the White House talking to Trump.
And Anatol, this has gone on for some time on this issue. The rest of the world really has not had a say. If you go back before the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, as we tend to call it, in 2015, it was a global issue. There was the so-called P5+1, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, Russia, China, France, UK and the US, and Germany. They were all involved, yet since Trump's been involved, it's very much a one-country show.
Well, yes, absolutely. As you say, all these, it was really, I mean, a rather strikingly good international effort, including Russia, to bring about this agreement, which Trump, of course, then tore up. And when he tore it up, when he came to power in 2017, European governments, including, by the way, Boris Johnson, at that time Conservative Prime Minister, said that the European countries remained committed to the JCPOA. But under American pressure, they were totally unable to do anything to maintain or defend it. And now, yes, unfortunately, they look completely impotent. And I mean, what is, I think, especially shocking for Europe is that despite, as we've just heard, the tremendous impact on Europe, more immediately than any other part of the world except for the Gulf, Trump made no pretense of consulting with Europe, even warning Europe what he was about to do. And now we have hundreds of thousands of European citizens and American citizens, of course, stranded in the Gulf.
Dominique, and we use first names on this programme, but I could call you General, and that shows you the seniority that you have had in the French system. You know about how alliances work. You've worked at NATO. You've dealt with other key allies when you've been working at the UN. How unusual is it for key allies like particularly France and the UK that sit as permanent members of the Security Council along with the US not to be fully consulted in something as big as this?
Yes, no, it's something very new. If we just remind the war in 23, is that at that time there was consultancy inside the Security Council. Now there is nothing. And I think it's more an Israeli war where the Americans are joining the Israelis concerning the threat on Israel, and so are not interested about talking with other countries. And it is very sad that only if there are consequences, then they will discuss. Because as it was said, JCPOA was thrown out by Mr. Trump in 10 years ago, roughly. But in fact, in the last discussion with Iran, he was talking only about the agreement which was accepted in 2015, which is a bit surprising.
Teresa, I mean, if we look at the various countries, and the one that's got the real ire of Donald Trump is, of course, Spain. The Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez has said, "We say no to breaking the international law that protects us all." That's his quote. He's saying what the others actually believe, but he's the only one who's daring to speak out, isn't he?
That's very true. And I think that
he's very popular domestically for taking this position. We also saw in the UK, for example, initially Starmer refused to let the US use their bases, but now because Cyprus is involved and they have a base there, they're also allowing the US to use their bases. So there's an initial reluctance for the domestic audience, and then for example, the UK gave in, but Spain has a trade surplus with the US, so a deficit with the US. So it's not that the US can really punish them economically, which Trump kind of tried to lash out and do, saying we'll put 100% tariffs on Spain. And so I think that Europeans have to bide their time carefully because of the feedback loop about Russia, the war in Ukraine. So they have to try to keep Trump on their side, even though the US is kind of under the Trump administration 2.0 have pulled back a lot from Ukraine, but they're very dependent on the US, not only in Ukraine, but also in the Gulf, which is a key region for them. So the Europeans are once again reminded about their holiday from history where they decreased defense spending for 30 years. The defense base is really eroded, and they need to develop a layered defense. Sometimes there's a lot of money sloshing around now to increase defense spending, but maybe it's not the most efficient way to do it. We're seeing even the US asking for help on drone warfare, which to my mind was a complete shock. We've had 4 years of war in Ukraine using drones, and now the Trump administration is asking President Zelensky of Ukraine to actually send experts to help them fight against Iran drones, the Shahed drones. So it's a very complex world that we're living in. It's very difficult, and I think that there's been a lack of strategic planning. Previous speakers spoke about not talking to the allies. The show's complete. Trump does not really try to cultivate ally support, but he's going to need it. And some have seen that this will help Russia because of the increase in energy prices, but we also see that Ukraine has a card to play in this, helping the US government learn the best techniques to fight against Iran Shahed drones.
Anatol, of the countries that Trump's been critical of, Spain, but then the UK, you heard Theresa there talking about
the way the UK is trying to explain this now, saying, yes, you can use our bases, but only for defensive missions. This from a country that always talks about its so-called special relationship with the United States. Pretty hard-hitting comments from Trump that Starmer is no Winston Churchill. What do you make of how that will be seen by the British government and the British people?
Well, as we just heard, there are great implications of all this for domestic politics in Europe. I mean, Sanchez has made himself more popular in Spain with his hard line against this war. Starmer, I think, has reinforced his image as a... We've seen across much of Europe. We have really quite feral. Tensions in Europe. So for Europe, this war is a disaster.
Dominique, let's rewind a little bit to a time I think you remember well, 2003. Then you were serving, because all of the missions, the embassies that are there at the UN in New York have top-level military people serving there too. You were serving in the French mission to the United Nations. Back in 2003, France and Germany took a very, very strong stand against George W. Bush's war plans in Iraq. Compare that with now. Yes, France does not think this is legal, but the criticism is much more muted, would you not agree? And why do you think that is?
Oh, yes, I think there are two major reasons. The first one is in 2003, we had no proof about the danger of Iraq and the fact that Iraq was linked to the 9/11 attacks. So we needed proof. We didn't have proof. The second point is that it was the only war. Currently, we have proof that Tehran is dangerous through, of course, against Israel, but also against all country with terrorism. And the second point is that we've got other war. And the strategic issue of Ukraine is more important for European. And we need U.S. with us on the fight against Moscow. And that's why probably the position is different.
Teresa, do you think there's also an aspect that about the way the Trump administration is conducting this war, that some might say this is not the way Western nations normally conduct war? I'm talking about, I mean, yes, there have been assassinations in history, but it tends to be a taboo that you start with a decapitation policy. Also, the sort of comments that come from the U.S. Defense Secretary, the Secretary of War, as he calls himself, Pete Hegseth, saying we're not going to worry about nation building, democracy building, or political correctness or rules of engagement for that matter. And even the White House putting out videos showing the war as some sort of video game. Do you think there's distaste about all of that?
Well, 2 points. The first point is in Europe, there's no tears being shed for the decapitation of the Ayatollah. I think that many people in Europe understood that Iran was really a threat. And there's been a lot of things happening in the lead up to this. For example, there was a ship stopped on the way from China to Iran, and some technology was removed. Some people have speculated that it was a hypersonic glide bomber that was moving to Iran. So there have been a lot of things that have been reported on, and things have been slowly adding up. But on the other hand, because of the Trump administration's approach to Europe, this kind of cavalier way that Hegseth speaks, of course, he's alienating a lot of Europeans. We saw a year ago at the Munich Security Conference, the Vance speech. This year we saw the Rubio speech, and Europeans just thought it was better than Vance's, so they stood up and clapped, not realizing initially that he was pretty much saying the same thing, but in a more diplomatic way. So the Europeans are kind of stuck. They're being squeezed. They don't have a lot of options here. And will this actually increase their ability to work together? I'm seeing initial fragmentation. We see issues on Hungary still blocking EU funding, 90 billion for Ukraine, because he wants to get oil from Russia and through the Druzhba pipeline, which was damaged by a drone. So he's being able to hold Europe hostage. And there's not a strength of view in Europe to punish Hungary. They had 4 years to get off Russian oil, and instead they actually increased dependency on Russian oil by 54%, some have analyzed. So the Europeans are even finding it difficult to get, it's like trying to get all these cats together. And Orban and Slovakia are kind of traditional countries that are very pro-Russia, and they're always kind of